Old man beat a German shepherd with a metal rod. Then a passing soldier did the unthinkable. "Get up, you useless mutt! I said get up!" the old man barked, his voice jagged with venom as the metal rod crashed down again. The dog didn't move this time, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. His legs had buckled, ribs heaving against the cold concrete, patches of his once sleek coat matted with blood and dirt. Each breath was shallow, but he still looked up, not with defiance, but with something far more heartbreaking. Hope. A dying hope that someone might stop this. The alley behind the mechanic's yard was silent, except for the thuds and the old man's ragged grunts. No one came here, not this far out in a forgotten town, where even the lights didn't bother to flicker on anymore. The German shepherd, barely a year old, had known only this place. And this man, he didn't remember how long he'd been here. Long enough for the chain around his neck to rust into his fur. Long enough to forget what it felt like to be touched with kindness. But the pain, that never left. It became the rhythm of his days. Kicks for barking, beatings for shivering, silence for obedience, until that day. Down the cracked road, the echo of boots on gravel approached with steady purpose. A figure appeared at the mouth of the alley, tall, broad-shouldered, in dusty fatigues and combat boots that had seen too many miles. Staff Sergeant Daniel Reyes wasn't looking for a fight. He'd just returned from overseas, stopping through the town where he grew up, hoping for a quiet visit with his uncle. He never made it to the porch. Instead, he froze as he turned the corner and saw the scene unfold, the raised rod, the cowering dog, the madness in the old man's eyes. In a second, the world shifted. It wasn't a back alley anymore. It was Fallujah, Kabul. The chaos of helplessness echoed in his bones, and his training didn't wait. "Drop it. Now." His voice cut through the air like a bullet. The old man, jolted, startled. He turned, sneering. "Mind your business, soldier boy. This here's my dog. I'll do as I damn well please." Daniel didn't move. His hand was clenched tight at his side. The anger in his chest burned hotter than any battlefield. Not just because of what he was seeing, but because of what he remembered. His unit had lost their K9, Jax, just 6 months earlier. Jax had saved 3 men before the blast took him. And now, here was another German shepherd, lying broken under the boot of a monster. "Step away from him," Daniel said again, this time with the kind of calm that warned of a coming storm. The old man smirked. "Or what? You gonna arrest me? You even got jurisdiction out here, hero?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he slowly walked forward, eyes locked with the dog's. That was when he saw it. Just a flicker, a tiny twitch of a tail, the faintest lift of an ear. The dog was still alive, still fighting. When the old man didn't move, Daniel did something unthinkable. He got down on one knee, ignoring the filth, ignoring the rusted chain, and placed his hand near the dog's paw. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, the way he used to speak to Jax before every mission. "You're safe now. I've got you." The dog flinched but didn't pull away. He blinked once, slowly, painfully, the kind of blink that said, "Please don't leave me here," and Daniel didn't. The old man lunged forward again, rod raised. But this time Daniel was faster. He caught the man's wrist mid-swing and yanked it backward. The rod clattered to the ground and the old man stumbled, shouting curses. Daniel didn't hit him. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than rage. He simply stood and stared until the old man finally backed away, muttering threats he didn't have the spine to carry out. Daniel stayed with the dog. He unhooked the chain with shaking fingers, his heart pounding as if it might shatter through. His ribs, blood smeared across his hands, but he didn't care. The dog was still breathing. That's all that mattered. Minutes later, Daniel was carrying the limp shepherd in his arms down the street, ignoring every passerby's stare. When he reached his uncle's front porch, his voice broke as he knocked on the door. "I need a vet, now." Inside, the old man's cruelty faded behind them, but the damage remained. Daniel didn't even know the dog's name, if he'd ever been given one. But as he placed him gently on a towel and watched the slow rise and fall of his chest, he whispered, "You don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm not leaving." And in that moment, despite all the pain, the dog did something Daniel hadn't expected. He licked his hand, just once. And Daniel knew then, this story wasn't going to end in a tragedy. It was only just beginning. The house smelled of antiseptic and regret. Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor beside the battered dog, now wrapped in soft towels that were slowly turning red. Every so often the shepherd would whimper in his sleep, legs twitching like he was still running from something. Daniel reached, out and gently placed his hand on the pup's back, whispering, "You're safe, I promise." His uncle, George, paced nearby, phone pressed to his ear as he tried again to get a hold of the nearest emergency vet clinic. Most were closed. It was past midnight. The nearest 24-hour vet was an hour away. Every minute that passed felt like Daniel was losing something he didn't even realize he'd needed, something tied to a memory of another shepherd, another war zone, and another promise he hadn't been able to keep. "I'll drive him," Daniel said the moment George ended the call. "Now, can you ride with me and keep pressure on the wounds?" George didn't argue. In 10 minutes, they were speeding down the dark road, Daniel's eyes flicking between the GPS and the rearview mirror where George sat, cradling the dog like an injured child. They didn't talk much. The tension in the car was too heavy, too raw. Only the sound of the dog's shallow breathing reminded them both of the urgency. When they finally reached the clinic, Daniel ran in with the shepherd in his arms, yelling for help. The staff responded fast. A young vet named Dr. Lena took one look at the dog and motioned them into the emergency room. Daniel was forced to stop at the doorway, hands shaking, as nurses closed the curtain behind her. That wait was the worst of his life. He stood in the hallway, pacing, clenching his fists, flinching every time he heard a bark or a cry. George brought him a bottle of water, but he barely touched it. The smell of blood clung to his shirt, and he didn't care. Finally, after what felt like hours, Dr. Lena returned. She looked exhausted but calm. "He's stable, for now. Multiple bruises, cracked ribs, and severe dehydration, but no internal bleeding. You got him here just in time." Daniel exhaled like someone had punched the air out of his lungs. "Will he recover?" "With time," she nodded. "He's a fighter, but he's going to need a lot of care, patience, and trust building. This kind of trauma, it doesn't go away easily." Daniel stepped into the small recovery room, where the shepherd now lay under warm lights, hooked to fluids. His eyes fluttered open when he heard the familiar footsteps. Daniel crouched beside him and whispered, "You're not alone anymore. I've got you." A few days passed. The dog stayed in the clinic under observation, but Daniel visited every morning and every night. He brought blankets, toys, and even read aloud sometimes, not because the dog understood the words, but because he believed the voice mattered. He started calling him Ghost, a name born out of the way the dog used to flinch at his own reflection in the metal exam table, as if haunted by something he couldn't explain. Then one morning, Dr. Lena met Daniel with a surprising offer. He won't be going back to that man. "The police got involved after you reported it. The shelter's overloaded and, well, you've clearly already become his person. Have you considered adopting him?" Daniel hadn't, not officially, but the answer slipped out before he could even think. "Yes, I want him." The adoption happened quietly. Paperwork, signatures, a few legal hurdles. But within a week, Ghost was home. Not just at any home, Daniel's. The soldier who had spent most of his life searching for peace in the loudest places was now learning to find it in the soft shuffle of paws across hardwood floors and the quiet sighs of a dog curled up beside his bed. But healing was not linear. Ghost still flinched at raised voices. He panicked at the sound of a metal clink. The first time Daniel wore a belt, Ghost hid under the couch for 2 hours. But there were signs of change, too. He began eating again, slowly. He followed Daniel around the house, tail wagging just barely. And one night, when a thunderstorm cracked the sky open, Ghost didn't run. He climbed onto Daniel's bed and curled beside him, resting his head against the man's chest, like he belonged there all along. Then came the twist neither of them saw coming. One quiet afternoon, Daniel took Ghost to the park. It was meant to be a short walk, but as they passed a playground, Ghost froze. His ears perked, his body rigid, eyes fixed on something. Daniel followed his gaze and saw a young boy, about 7, crying near the swings, completely alone. Before Daniel could react, Ghost pulled forward on the leash and sat down beside the boy, gently pressing his nose against the child's arm. The boy looked up, startled, but then he smiled. He wiped his tears and began to pet Ghost's head, talking softly, though no one could hear what he said. A moment later, the boy's mother came rushing over, explaining in a shaky voice that her son had nonverbal autism and hadn't spoken in weeks. Until now. Daniel blinked. He spoke. To Ghost? She nodded, crying. And right there, in that small park under a fading sun, Daniel realized something profound. Ghost hadn't just survived cruelty. He was becoming a healer. This wasn't just a rescue story. It was a rebirth. and it was only the beginning. The next few days passed in slow fragments. The dog, now named Ghost, rested under the quiet care of Daniel, who had transformed his guest room into a recovery haven. The floor was layered with thick blankets. Bowls of water were changed twice daily, and Daniel had even placed a small nightlight nearby, after realizing Ghost wouldn't sleep unless some light stayed on. It was as if darkness brought back the shadows of every beating he had endured. Ghost didn't bark. He didn't growl or whimper, but he watched, always watched. His pale, intelligent eyes followed Daniel's every move, not with fear, but with a fragile kind of curiosity. Daniel never pushed. He moved slowly, deliberately, always speaking in low tones. The soldier had seen enough trauma to understand that silence could scream louder than any noise. On the fourth morning, as Daniel set down a bowl of food and turned to leave, he heard the soft shuffle of paws behind him. He froze, heart thudding. Ghost had gotten up, on his own, and was following. Not running, not retreating, just following. That was the moment Daniel knew trust had cracked open, even just a sliver. But with that fragile trust came unexpected trouble. That evening, a knock rattled the front door. Daniel opened it to find a man in uniform, Officer Terrell, a local cop who had followed up on Daniel's report. His expression was grim. "We got the address you gave us. That old man, we confronted him. He claims the dog is his property, and now he's pushing to get him back. Technically, the law's on his side unless we prove sustained abuse." Daniel's fists clenched. "You saw the injuries." "We did. But he's calling it a single discipline incident. Claims the dog bit him first. He's lying." "Believe you," Terrell said firmly. "But the system's messy. The only way to keep this dog out of his hands is to go public. Make noise. People need to know what he did. That'll put pressure on animal control to take action." Daniel hated the idea of turning Ghost into a story. The pup had already been used and discarded. He didn't deserve flashing cameras and hashtags. But if it meant protecting him, then Daniel would walk through fire. He sat down that night and wrote. Not a social media post, but a letter. Honest, raw. He described everything, from the moment he heard the first scream in that alley to the second Ghost lifted his head in the clinic. He didn't spare any detail. Not the cracked ribs, not the silence in Ghost's eyes, not the rage that rose in his chest like thunder. And at the end, he wrote one line that would soon echo across the internet. "If we can't protect the voiceless, then what use is our strength?" He sent it to a military buddy who ran a blog about veterans and rescue dogs. Within hours, it was shared thousands of times. By morning, news crews were calling. Activists were organizing protests outside the old man's home. A petition was gaining signatures by the minute, but not everyone was happy. 2 days later, Daniel returned from a grocery run to find his front gate hanging open and muddy footprints near his porch. Panic surged. He rushed inside and found Ghost hiding behind the couch, trembling. Someone had broken in, but hadn't taken anything, just left the gate open. A message, no doubt. That was the moment Daniel snapped, not with fear, but with purpose. He installed cameras. He called Officer Terrell and demanded a restraining order. And then, he made one more call to a man named Sergeant Dean Holloway, who ran a private K-9 rehab center just outside town. Daniel had served with him once in Afghanistan. If anyone understood what Ghost needed, it was Dean. "Bring him in," Dean said without hesitation. "Let's see what he remembers." Daniel was nervous. Ghost had made slow, cautious progress, but he'd never been around other dogs, or loud commands, since the alley. But the moment they arrived at the center, something changed. Ghost perked up. He sniffed the air. His ears twitched. And when Dean knelt and gave a short, clipped whistle, Ghost stood. "He was trained," Dean said softly. "This dog, he was military stock. K-9 division, no doubt. Someone discarded him like trash." Daniel's throat tightened. Then, "I'll help him remember who he is." The next weeks became a transformation. Daniel brought Ghost every morning. He watched as Dean worked him gently, encouraging with commands, letting Ghost relearn not just obedience, but confidence. They didn't force anything. It was a dance of patience and praise, and Ghost responded. He started trotting beside Daniel, without hesitation. He responded to his name. He even barked once, sharp and proud, when Dean tossed him a rope toy and shouted, "Good boy!" The final turning point came unexpectedly. During a visit to the center, a school brought in a group of children to learn about rescue dogs. One boy wandered too close to the fence, stumbled, and cried out as his hand scraped against the wood. The sound triggered a chain reaction. Dogs barked, some lunged in excitement, but Ghost didn't. He ran to the boy, calm, steady, and sat beside him, licking the scraped knuckles with careful tenderness. The boy smiled through his tears. Ghost wagged his tail, really wagged it, for the first time. Daniel turned away, pretending to adjust his jacket so no one saw his eyes watering. Back home that night, Ghost curled up beside Daniel's boots. The TV hummed in the background, but neither of them were really watching. They didn't need noise, just presence. Daniel reached down and ran his fingers through Ghost's thick fur, and for the first time, Ghost leaned into the touch without flinching. He had come back to life, and so had Daniel, but something bigger stirred beneath the surface now, a mission Daniel hadn't planned for, because Ghost's story wasn't just about survival. It was about how every broken soul deserves a second chance, and they were just getting started. The weeks passed like chapters in a recovery journal, some filled with small triumphs, others weighted with setbacks. Ghost's transformation under Daniel's care was undeniable, but fragile. The dog who once cowered at every movement now stood taller, responded to commands with quiet confidence, and even greeted visitors with hesitant curiosity. Yet, the scars beneath his fur told a story that time alone couldn't erase. Daniel had become his anchor. Every morning they walked side by side through town, Daniel sipping his coffee while Ghost scanned every sound with alert ears. People had begun to recognize them. Neighbors waved, children pointed and smiled. The man who had once stormed through battles was now known as the one with the dog who almost died. And strangely, Daniel welcomed it. Ghost wasn't a burden. He was a purpose Daniel hadn't realized he needed. But one cloudy Thursday, that fragile calm was shattered. Daniel had taken Ghost to the town's monthly open-air market. It was a crowded, buzzing place, full of chatter and clinking metal stalls. Ghost, tethered gently beside him, handled it better than expected. That was until a voice cut through the air like a jagged blade. "There he is! That's my dog, right there!" Daniel froze. His spine stiffened as he turned, his hand instinctively tightening on the leash. It was him, the old man, Silas Quinn, standing just beyond the bakery stall, flanked by a thin, smirking lawyer and a uniformed animal control officer. The same hands that once swung a metal rod now pointed directly at Ghost like a cruel claim. Ghost whimpered, then growled low and deep, not in fear, but recognition. His body shifted behind Daniel's legs, tail tucked, eyes wide. Daniel stepped, in front, planting himself between the dog and the man like a wall of resolve. "He's not yours anymore," Daniel said coldly, every syllable lined with steel. The lawyer spoke next. "Mr. Quinn has filed for return of property. Unless you can provide direct evidence of ownership transfer or certified abuse documentation, he remains the legal owner. I saved this dog's life. That's all the ownership I need." "That's not how the law works," the officer interjected. "But it is how the courts work. You'll be receiving a summons by next week." The crowd around them had begun to hush, ears perked and eyes wide. Someone muttered, "That's the guy who beat him." Another snapped a picture, and then, before anyone could stop him, Silas stepped forward. "Come here, mutt," he hissed, his voice sugar-coated with mock affection. "Let's go home." Ghost barked, loud, sharp. He backed away, dragging the leash so hard Daniel had to steady himself. And for the first time, the crowd turned fully in Ghost's favor. A woman called out, "He's scared of you! Leave him alone!" Someone else shouted, "You're not taking him back! Not after what you did!" The officer hesitated. The lawyer whispered something and retreated with Silas, who threw a final glare at Daniel and spat on the pavement. "You think this is over? It's not!" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to, because Ghost had already spoken in the only way that mattered. Back at home, Daniel paced. He could feel the rage simmering beneath his skin. He had fought wars, faced enemies with weapons in hand, and now he was battling bureaucracy. Silas hadn't come for Ghost out of love. He came to reclaim power, ego, and maybe because deep down he couldn't stand that the dog had survived without him. Later that night, as Ghost lay curled near the fireplace, Daniel sat in silence, staring at a folder he hadn't opened in years. Inside were papers, honorable discharge certificates, letters from fallen comrades, and a photograph of a K9 named Major, the dog that hadn't made it home, his partner, his friend. Ghost reminded him so much of him. Same eyes, same loyalty, same pain. He took a breath and made a decision. Daniel called Sergeant Dean Holloway again and said just one sentence. It's time. The next day, Daniel drove Ghost back to the K9 Rehabilitation Center. But this time, not just as a visitor. He handed over the documents Dean had requested. Ghost's prior military microchip had been traced. Records confirmed his early training, his abandonment, and his likely ties to a failed contractor program. With that proof, Silas's case would crumble. Daniel smiled for the first time in days, but that wasn't all. Dean invited Daniel and Ghost to participate in the center's pilot program, pairing rescued ex-K9s with struggling veterans. Ghost would be the first ambassador, not just a survivor, but a mentor, an example of what healing could look like. As Daniel watched Ghost trot across the training field, tail higher than ever, he whispered, "Let him try to take you now. You're not just a dog anymore. You're a hero." "And Ghost?" he barked in response, short, proud, and free. The final part of this journey had begun, but the war was no longer against one cruel man. It was a fight for every voiceless soul still waiting to be seen. It was the courtroom silence that struck Daniel the most. Not the polished wood or the heavy robes, but the stillness, like everyone was holding their breath for the truth to land. Ghost sat beside him, not in a cage, not behind a barrier, but freely at his side, calm and composed in his vest. The judge's eyes had softened the moment she saw the scars beneath his coat, and the steady way he placed his head on Daniel's boot like it was home. Across the aisle, Silas Quinn sat stone-faced, his lawyer flipping through pages that no longer held weight. The evidence was overwhelming now. Medical records, expert testimony from the K9 Rehabilitation Center, and the final blow. The military chip scan showing Ghost's training history and abandonment. Ghost wasn't just a dog. He had served. He had been thrown away, and now he'd been reclaimed, not by the man who broke him, but by the man who helped him heal. The ruling came like a sunrise, gentle but absolute. Legal custody was awarded to Daniel. Silas was issued a permanent ban from owning animals. The room didn't erupt in applause, but the relief hung thick in the air. Ghost didn't move. He didn't understand court systems or justice, but he understood Daniel's hand resting on his neck, and that was enough. Outside the courthouse, a quiet crowd had gathered. Reporters held cameras, but none dared crowd the pair as they descended the steps. Ghost walked with his head high, no longer the trembling shadow in a broken alley. And when a little girl approached and knelt down to pet him, Ghost leaned in and let her. That one moment told the world what no headline could. He wasn't afraid anymore. Daniel didn't return to his old life after that. He didn't retreat back into quiet routines or disappear once the noise faded. Instead, he followed through on a promise he hadn't realized he made. He partnered with Sergeant Dean Holloway to launch a foundation, Second Stride, dedicated to pairing rehabilitated working dogs with veterans suffering from PTSD and depression. Ghost was the first success story, but not the last. Every new pairing brought its own emotional weight. Dogs who'd been beaten, chained, left for dead. Men and women who carried invisible scars no one dared ask about. Together they found balance, one soul helping the other stand. Ghost quickly became the symbol of the foundation, not just in flyers and social media posts, but in spirit. He would sit calmly during workshops, offering silent comfort to those who trembled. And when a new veteran hesitated to open up, all it took was Ghost's quiet presence, his steady breathing, his scarred but serene gaze, to say, "You're not alone anymore." Daniel often caught himself thinking about that alley, about how easily he could have walked past, about how close Ghost came to dying unloved, unseen, and it terrified him, not because of what almost happened, but because of how many others were still happening. Every story he heard now, every abandoned K9 they rescued, reminded him that Ghost wasn't the exception. He was just the one someone cared enough to stop for. Years passed. The foundation grew. Awards came in, but Daniel kept them in a drawer. Ghost didn't need trophies. He needed early morning walks, belly rubs, and the peace of being safe. One quiet Sunday morning, Daniel took Ghost to the edge of the forest trail they loved. The wind was soft, the light golden, and Ghost, now, slower, a little grayer, sat beside him, watching the trees sway. Daniel reached over and rubbed the back of his ear, the way Ghost always liked. "You know," Daniel whispered, voice catching in the wind. "You saved me, too." Ghost didn't look at him. He didn't need to. He just leaned in a little closer, the weight of his head heavy on Daniel's thigh. No bark, no sound, just trust. And in that stillness, Daniel understood something simple and final. They had both come from war zones, one of bullets, the other of beatings, but they had made it out because one of them chose not to walk away. Sometimes the unthinkable thing a soldier can do is kneel beside the broken and stay.